Now, according to evolutionists, the comets are the same age as the solar system, about 5 billion years, that they were created and happened and occurred at the time of the Big Bang, when everything began to coalesce. So we have some problems with this view. One major problem with it is that comets, because they break up so soon, well, maybe they're coming from somewhere else. Maybe they didn't come at the beginning or at the creation of the universe. So evolutionists have said, well, there's an unobserved cloud well outside of Pluto's orbit, and it's called the Oort cloud, and that comets from this cloud that exists out there somewhere are somehow shaken loose out of this cloud, maybe by a very infrequent passing star, a star that would, the gravity would kind of pull and would dislodge a comet. And then as our solar system, everything's moving, as our solar system moves by, the pull of the sun would pull that comet, and it would go into a period and a definite time in orbit around the sun. Now, the problem with that is that that Oort cloud, no one's seen it. It's just sort of this hypothetical thing that, well, we think there's probably something like that out there. So it's sort of like inventing a thing to cover the problem with your theory. There's a newer theory of a Kuiper belt of comet sources that lie in the same plane as our solar system. And again, that's outside of Pluto. But again, this is very improbable that it's actually there. No one has seen it. It's not based on observation. I think Dan Neal had something to say about that in the End of Science lecture that he gave. But this is a good example. This is inventing something from no evidence, but it handles your theory a little bit. So it's hopeful science, I guess, is what you might say, instead of observed science. The 10,000-year age of many comets does, though, coincide with the creation account. Because if that's as long as they last, well, that's as long as the scripture teaches that the world has been around, somewhere in that range. Not enough mud on the seafloor. Well, the evolution theory calls for the ocean floor to be about 200 million years old. So if it is that old, we would expect to see deposits, because we can measure the amount of material that's being deposited off the continents, that's flowing out of the Mississippi, the Hudson, the Connecticut, all these different rivers. We can put a number to that. And the number that they've got is about 25 billion tons of rock and dirt from the continents end up each year into the sea. Rough number, 25 billion. Now, we observe on the ocean floor an average depth of 800 feet of mud. So if you take the continental shelves, some of which have thousands and thousands of feet of sediments, and you look at the abyssal plain, and you look at all of the areas of the ocean, and smooth that out, we would have an average of about 800 feet of mud. That number would say that at the present rate of deposition, the present rate that the continents are losing dirt and mud and sand, that they have been eroding for about 15 million years, not 5 billion, or actually in this case 200 million years old, is what they're saying. So again, a much earlier figure, much smaller figure. So one of the problems with the uniformitarian view here is that even with subduction, so we know that at the edges of continents there's subduction zones, and that some of that sediment, an evolutionist could say, well, wait a minute, sediments are going under the continents. They're being subducted. Well, we can put a number to that too. And we can observe and estimate that about 1 billion tons per year are being subducted. But what about the other 24? So the other 24 billion tons are going out into the ocean basins. So according to evolution, the erosion and plate subduction have continued the entire pretty close to the entire age of the Earth, at least 3 billion years. So if that's true, we would expect to see huge amounts of piled up sediments. And again, this 800 feet, only 800 feet, which is about 15 million years worth of erosion, is much, much smaller. Now, as a creationist, we can even go a little further, can't we? Because we could say that though that amount of sediment is deposited, and that would lead us to think that the world was 15 million years old, actually, a lot of that would have been deposited during Noah's flood. So a big catastrophe. See, again, we have to think outside the uniformitarian box. But that box that says 25 billion tons a year, that could have wildly been accelerated. That could have been into the trillions of tons at the time of Noah's flood. So again, a creation view would lead us really to where the data seems to direct. Not enough sodium in the sea. There are 450 million tons of sodium every year that's dumped into the sea, and along with other elements. Seawater contains just about every element that's on the periodic table. And in fact, gold is floating around out in the sea. And if you were to take a cubic mile of seawater and somehow pull all the water out of that and segregate the gold, you'd have about $93 million worth of gold from every cubic mile, or excuse me, $93,000 of gold from a cubic mile of seawater. So these things are all floating around in the ocean. It's very soluble, and they're floating around. And sodium is one of those things. They're all being eroded off of the continental land masses. But only 27% of that sodium gets back to the land each year. So they can measure how much sodium from evaporation as the oceans evaporate, and of course some of that evaporation will carry, and as the water evaporates, little particles of sodium or salt are left in the air, and they can blow onto the land. Of course, they affect vegetation, and you'll notice on the seacoast like North Carolina, very salt-tolerant plants live along the coast because they're getting all that salt that's blowing off the sea, because the sea, the water's evaporating, leaving that salt in the air. So if you can put a number to that, about 27% gets back to land each year. So at today's input and at rate, it would take 42 million years, not billions of years, but 42 million years to accumulate. So had it accumulated really fast, like during the flood, the age of the earth could be much smaller, much younger. So again, a flood helps us out on that one, doesn't it? I mean, in the sense that it can bring about more washout into the oceans. So there have been lower input rates in the past. An evolutionist would say maybe there's just a lower input rate, or maybe in the past there was more sodium leaving the sea, and that's why it looks like the world is only 42 million years instead of 5 billion. But even if we take that and take some of those arguments into account and come up with the most generous calculation for the age, we can see that it would still be 62 million years old. You've been taking into their best arguments on that. And not only that, but there are other substances in the sea also give us a younger age. So it's not just sodium, it's many other substances that give us that data. Another point that Humphreys brings out, and that I've observed myself in doing some geology, is that strata are often very tightly bent, and they almost it almost goes against reason when you look at these strata. How could these strata be millions of years old and they're bent without cracking? I remember being in the Appalachians in Virginia, looking at a road cut and seeing some recumbent folds. Now these folds are 5 feet wide, or 5 feet wide, and they're folded over and they double back on themselves. In other words, they go into a hairpin-like fold. And you look all the way along and there's no fractures in the rock. How did rock deform like that without fracturing? Well, in many cases, I don't think it did. I think what happened, it wasn't solid rock, it was still wet. It was recently deposited, And if you take recently deposited rock and bend it, it's much more flexible. So how can it be so tightly bent without breaking? The strata was wet. And the age is really thousands of years for that layer, not the millions of years that's attributed. So again, you're coming at it from a different way of looking at it. You have to get outside of the uniformitarian box and take a look a little bit differently. Now, the Cambrian Sasquatch, which is a sandstone west of Colorado Springs, has been extruded into the surface, or all the way to the surface, along a fault. The name of the fault is Ute Pass, and the date evolution gives this is 70 million years ago. So the question is, how can you have solid sandstone being pushed up through a fault and extruded to the surface through younger rock? And how does that work? How do you have sandstone do that? And so likely this, and I don't know, many of you may have seen this, but it's not far from Manitou Springs, which is where Summit Ministries has its headquarters in Colorado Springs. But likely this Sasquatch sandstone was unsolidified. So rather than it being millions of years old, which is what it's attributed to be, it was probably thousands of years. Again, it would be evidence that these were wet sediments that were then pushed up, and that's what it looks like. That would seem to answer that situation. And lastly, I want to cover the helium is lacking in an old atmosphere. So I mentioned earlier that all the elements that are radioactive, all the rocks radioactive, give off helium. And helium being a very light element, it's number 2 on the periodic table, very, very light. It passes up into the atmosphere. And this helium is held in the atmosphere, and minute amounts just very minute amounts do pass into space, but we can calculate those pretty closely. So today, though, as we look at the atmosphere, this has only 0.05% of the amount of helium you would expect for an Earth of 5 billion years age. Just a minuscule amount. In fact, if you do the math, it makes the Earth thousands of years, not billions of years old, on the basis of the helium. There's also helium that's trapped in the deep rocks in the Jemez caldera up north of here, and they've sunk various wells, basically, down into the rock. And of course, most of you know that the Jemez, there's a plume, a volcanic plume that's not too far from the surface there, causing hot springs, causing they actually had some geothermal activity there. And so this helium that's trapped has not had time to escape, though those rocks are said to be over 1 billion years old. Okay, the bedrock that it's coming from. So obviously, they're much younger rocks. They've had time to escape, but they haven't. It's because they're younger rocks. Both problems suggest that this Earth is an age of only thousands, not millions and billions. So there is evidence out there. I would encourage you all to pick this up. This is a good little description. He does a better job explaining it than I do. Russ Humphreys is a dear friend of ours, and I know that he's done a great job with that. Also, one thing that's very valuable is on the back page, he goes into the scientific data and the sources where he's drawn his material.